At 4:30 in the morning on January 17th, 1994, my dog jumped on my chest and dove under the bed in my apartment in California's San Fernando Valley. Before I had time to question what my dog was trying to tell me, I was thrown out of bed by violent shaking that would last for 20 seconds, but felt like an eternity. The violent shaking became known as the 94 Northridge, California earthquake, and it had a magnitude of 6.7. 60 people were killed, and more than 9,000 were injured, and property damage was estimated to be somewhere between $13 to $50 billion. Included in that damage was the apartment building I called home as a rabbinical student at the American Jewish University. As I emerged from my bedroom, climbing over furniture that had been tossed around, and shined my flashlight into the kitchen to see that my refrigerator had actually tipped over, I saw some faint light and dust coming from the threshold of my front door. And there was a gaping hole separating my unit from the hallway, a hole that exposed the parking garage 3 floors down. As I knew this wasn't a good sign, I grabbed my dog, a few belongings, jumped from my front door to the main hallway, and got out of the building as quickly as I could. And for the next several hours, my neighbors and I gathered in the courtyard of our complex, trying to figure out what to do next. There was no electricity, there were no phones, there was an eerie silence, one that was pierced by occasional sirens. There was the smell of fires and the frightening jolts of pretty intense aftershocks. The next several days were a blur, reading the news from the Goodyear blimp as it floated above the San Fernando Valley, getting a temporary roof over my head and a safe floor under my feet, seeing coverage of the earthquake on the television when I found a safe place with power to watch it, and realizing how lucky I was given the devastation in my own neighborhood. Learning that my apartment had been condemned and I had a short period of time to somehow gather my belongings and relocate in a city that looked like it had been hit by a bomb. On Sukkot, we read the words of the prophet Zechariah, who said that a great earthquake will split the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And when the earth settles, the prophet says, Adonai echad u'shemo echad. God will be one, and God's name will be one. Never again will destruction be decreed, and Jerusalem will dwell secure. After the fault appears and the subsequent shattering takes place, peace will come. As I looked into that gaping hole in my apartment and saw the parking garage 3 floors below, as I traveled through my neighborhood and saw fires and shattered glass and broken homes, as I learned about the deaths and the injuries caused by the earthquake, I realized while there was no visible rupturing of the earth that resulted in the Northridge earthquake, I was looking into and experiencing the fault, the shattering. Within that fault and within the short period of time I was given to relocate, somehow, some way, several days later, I found myself waking up in the same bed that the earth tossed me out of at 4:30 in the morning on January 17th, 1994. This time, however, I was woken up not by my dog jumping on my chest before the big one hit, but rather the sounds of the Pacific Ocean, her waves breaking outside. And I could smell the sea air coming through my bedroom window. Adonai echad u'shemo echad. God will be one, and God's name will be one. Peace. The earthquake had come, but it was followed by the comfort that a much-needed day at the beach can bring. The beach is where I found my new home, Venice Beach to be exact, a beautiful place to live in 1994, unlike the experience that many people have there today. Amid the chaos, my landlord redeemed me from the brokenness of the San Fernando Valley and relocated me to an oceanfront condo right on the boardwalk. The fractured landscape of the valley and surrounding areas that had bombarded me after the earthquake was replaced by my new beach views. My nerves soothed by the lull of the waves. In time, power was restored to the hard-hit areas. Shattered glass was cleaned up and replaced. Roads were repaired. So were homes. Those who were killed in the quake were eulogized, mourned, and remembered. Those injured, they healed and they rejoined us. Classes resumed at the American Jewish University, and within time, the magic that is Los Angeles returned, even as the ground continued to shake from the aftershocks. And I learned that the very best we can do is shake with the ground, mourn those we have lost, help those who need help, start rebuilding on the ruins of what was, and reconnect to the magic and to the beauty and the holy sparks that fill this world, even as the ground continues to shift in ways we can't control. The Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai wrote, "From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood." An important reminder of what Judaism has taught us for centuries. God can be experienced in the broken places. From the ancient exchange documented in the Talmud between the prophet Elijah and Rabbi Yossi, in which the rabbi tells Elijah that he heard the voice of God coming from a ruined building, to the lessons of Kabbalah that teach us that this beautiful world, this divine creation, came into being only after God's initial attempt at creation shattered and created all of us. Judaism is adamant that holiness exists in the faults, in the mess, in the brokenness. Now, this runs contrary to what most of us think and feel. So many of us see God in beautiful landscapes, in loving communities, in peace. We forget that these beautiful landscapes are products of thousands of years of shifting tectonic plates, volcanic eruptions, and monstrous storms. We forget that loving communities find their strength in and are so often products of the power of healing that comes after great divides. And true peace is only appreciated after a complete and utter shattering. Our world is broken. The pandemic, just one of the many things that's breaking her. Our country, our own South Florida community, is fractured, divided by many things, including political affiliation, the role and power of law enforcement, racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate. Israel is riddled with deep, overwhelming cracks that seem to be getting worse, cracks that divide Israel from her Arab neighbors and from the world, and cracks that are now so visibly dividing Jewish Israelis from Arab Israelis. This cracking began in Israel during the biblical era. We read about it today. Hagar and her son Ishmael, the father of the Arab world, are banished from Abraham's home. Isaac becomes the chosen son, and this choice is solidified by the story we read tomorrow, the Akedah. And with this choice comes a fault line between the children of Abraham, between the Jewish and the Arab worlds. It's a fault line that runs through many families, through some of our own families. Choices are made that push us apart. While the fault line in the Middle East is distinct, in essence, it's no different than the fault lines that have torn some of our families apart. In essence, it's no different than the fault lines that run through our country, dividing many based upon race and status and privilege and politics, vaccine status, and whether or not you wear a mask. That fault line in the Middle East, the one that is referred to these days as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a lot older than the fault lines we struggle with in our own homes and in our own country. And because of this, this fault line is seen by many as a permanent rupture in our global community, one that so many of us have accepted as the norm. We've lost hope in Israelis and Arabs, the children of Isaac and Ishmael living in peace. And so the fault line that separates us from them has become part of the global narrative. As we begin this new Jewish year, I'm asking us all to change this narrative. To remember that Judaism teaches us that holiness exists in the fault lines, that amazing things are built on what is broken, and from this building comes healing. And if we can find holiness in this ancient fault line, perhaps we can find holiness within the newer fault lines that shatter our lives in our own homes and in our own country. As many of you know, after the war in Israel in May and the related riots that tore apart certain Israeli cities, I traveled to the Jewish state with 17 other South Florida rabbis to see firsthand what was happening. I saw the fault line. It's there, and it's huge. I saw the trauma in the eyes of Jewish Israelis who have been living with terror for too long. I visited a Jewish home destroyed by a Hamas missile. I watched as an incendiary balloon was launched into Israel from Gaza. I met with Arab Israelis who are petrified that Israel is going to take the Al-Aqsa Mosque that stands in Jerusalem away from them. I talked with a Christian Arab who told me how he is discriminated against by Israeli Jews in Jerusalem. And my colleagues and I learned with Shireen Nator Hafi, the principal of the Arab high school in Lod, one of the Israeli cities ravaged by rioting between Jews and Arabs, a place where one Jew and one Arab were killed, where Jewish homes were burned, and a synagogue firebombed. This principal, Shireen, she made it clear. Part of the fault line that divides Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs is the fact that within her own Arab-Israeli community, there are, to use her own words, too many kings and not enough prophets. We heard this echoed by Israeli academic leaders who said American Jews who truly care about bringing about a two-state solution should shift some of their attention away from defending the narrative that we're right and they're wrong and focus some of their energy on helping Arab Israelis foster true leaders. At the same time, we need to own that we too have many kings and not enough prophets. We need to stop promoting a narrative that has for so long included Bibi Netanyahu and begin to promote the current narrative that includes the new, diverse, much needed, and very, very fragile Israeli government under the leadership of Naftali Bennett. While we sat with Shireen in her school's auditorium, she invited 3 of her students to join us, 3 Arab Israeli teenage boys. She looked at them and in Arabic and English, said that she was extremely disappointed that some of her students took part in the riots. The boys looked upset as they gazed down at the floor. She continued again in Arabic and English, looking at all of us. If we love each other, we won't kill each other. The boys nodded their head in agreement, and they looked at us, and in broken English, told us about their Jewish friends. They wanted us to know they had Jewish friends. And we also learned about their classmate, a young Arab girl who was killed by a Hamas missile during the recent war, a terrible reminder that Arab Israelis too are victims of Hamas terrorists. The boys were excited to meet American rabbis. They were respectful, yet very much teenagers. One of them proudly popped a bucket hat decorated with marijuana leaves on his head and smiled as he pointed to the hat. Shireen, the principal, not amused, quickly ripped it off his head. The boys all wanted to share their Instagram accounts with us, and in doing so, I learned that one of them is a talented Arabian horse trainer and rider. And he took such pride in showing us images of him on his horse and was excited to learn that our synagogue is located in a horse community. They shared bits and pieces of their lives with us, and we shared bits and pieces of ours. Shireen told us that she works closely with the principal of a Jewish high school in Jerusalem, and the two of them teaching their students how to build a loving, healthy, respectful, shared community within the Jewish state. When one of my colleagues asked Shireen how she felt about helping to build Israel as a non-Jew, she responded, "Why wouldn't I want to build this country? It's my home too." Well, this one colleague asked if she considered herself to be an Arab Israeli, a Palestinian Israeli. Her response, "Why does it matter? All of you," she said. "You're Jewish Americans. Some of your congregants, they are Israeli Americans. Am I right?" She continued, "You're all clearly minorities in your country, yet you help build it. Why do I, as a minority in this country," she asked, "need to be any different?" We sat in silence and we reflected on her answer. Prior to visiting with Shireen, we met with a local Lod rabbi in the city of Lod in his firebombed synagogue. One of the families who attends his shul, their home was destroyed by arson. You might have seen clips that I shared of their home destroyed by Arab rioters. And I will never, ever, ever forget the smell, the awful smell of that destroyed home. Shireen told us she is working with the rabbi, but quietly. People have become used to the fault line that divides Arabs and Jews in Israel. And she's got no patience for this fault, but she admitted to us that she has to be careful about how she goes about healing the divide. But the fact is, she's doing so. And what I learned in Israel in June is that she is not alone. She's joined, of course, by the rabbi in Lod, who immediately following the riots in his city went to an amazing place we visited, the Hinam Center, a non-political, non-sectoral organization that seeks to promote tolerance. There, the rabbi met with Muslim leaders from all over Israel for important, difficult, much-needed encounters and conversations. The Hinam Center is located in Abu Ghosh, an Arab town in Israel west of Jerusalem, one that remained neutral during the 1948 War of Independence that saw so much violence directed at the Jewish states from the Arab world. After the recent riots that tore through cities like Lod, Yair Lapid, the current Israeli foreign minister and alternate prime minister, reminded Israelis that the rioters don't represent every Israeli Arab or every Israeli Jew. And this was seen in mid-May in Abu Ghosh and in several cities across Israel. Jews and Arabs coming together in large groups, playing music, dancing, waving flags, holding flowers, showing us that within the fault line that the world is obsessed with, there has been and there continues to be bridges of love, friendship, and compassion for fellow Israelis, no matter their religious identity or their ethnic identity. This love, this friendship, this compassion challenges the narrative of the fault line that's too easily promoted. Now, don't get me wrong. The fault line is real. Just like here in the United States, there are societal issues that need to be addressed. But we should not overlook the fact that the drama associated with the fault makes headlines and attracts viewers and readers. And this helps promote causes and raise dollars to support organizations grounded in the fault, not in the healing. The love and the friendship and the compassion, these forces help bridge the fault line and thus threaten the narrative that the media, that the politicians, that the activists, that many of the NGOs and even the extremists, the terrorists need to survive. And so we don't hear enough about the love and the friendship and the compassion in Israel. We don't hear about the Arab Israeli teachers who are dedicated to bridging the divide despite tremendous challenges to teach Jewish students in Jewish Israeli schools. And we don't hear about the Jewish Israeli teachers working in Arab schools. We don't hear about the Jewish and Arab doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals who every single day work together to help everyone who calls Israel home and even help those people in surrounding areas outside of Israel. We don't hear about the new Israeli government, the most inclusive government in Israel's history, one that includes an Arab party in the coalition, religious Jews, secular Jews, a reform rabbi, the most women ever in the Israeli cabinet, a Druze member, and the first deaf minister. The fault is real, but there are holy sparks, bright sparks of coexistence, of people committed to building a shared society, shining brightly within the fault, picking up the shattered pieces and building beautiful things. And we need to focus on the sparks. While in Israel in June, we met with a professor who told us about his daughter, a young Jewish professional who lives in Yaffo, a southern portion of Tel Aviv. Yaffo was hit with riots in May. While the professor urged his daughter to leave the city, the area during the riots, she refused. It's her home. And she did her best to keep safe. But one night, in the midst of one of the riots, she was attacked on her way back to her apartment. Her attackers, Arab men, beat her terribly. But for some reason, they let her go, and she ran home and was greeted by her neighbor who took her in, who embraced her, who cleaned and bandaged her, and took care of her with so much love. And she has since recovered. And she is so grateful for her neighbor, an Arab woman. This act of love happens in the fault line. Holy sparks fly. Holy sparks flew as we sat in the middle of Lod, my colleagues and I, and shared time with the rabbi and his community, and with Shireen and her students. Again, the words of Yehuda Amichai, from the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. From the ruins come the whisper of God, those sparks. They're not just flying in Israel. Even in the midst of our own turmoil here at home, there are bridge builders, healers, and even a prophet or two. It's all too easy to stand at the fault and look in and see the destruction and shake our heads at this shattering. It's so much harder to stand within the fault and see the good. But if you can, you'll meet people like Shireen, like the folks at the Hinam Center, like the rabbi in Lod, like so many Israelis who are working together to build a shared society. If you can do it here at home, you'll encounter people who are living and promoting the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. You'll meet members of law enforcement who inspire. You'll see rescue workers putting their own lives on the line when the world turns upside down, as it did in Surfside and 20 years ago in New York City and Washington, D.C. You'll see politicians who care about their constituents, healthcare workers and scientists who are working tirelessly to combat this pandemic, and good people going about their daily lives trying to lift up those around them with acts of love and kindness. It's easy. It's easy to focus on the racists and the anti-Semites and the haters of all type, all that is broken and those doing the breaking. That's what the breakers want us to do. Today, I ask you to join me in shifting your focus away from what is broken, look into the fault, and see the holy sparks that are flying around this broken world. The amazing people healing our world right now. Support them, join them, be inspired by some of these people. Remember that our tradition teaches us that our job is not to stand on the sidelines and shake our heads at the brokenness. Our job is to do tikkun olam, literally heal the world, even while it's still shaking. Don't just stare into the fault. Dive in and join the healers. At the end of our service in a little bit, we'll do something we only do on the high holidays. As we say the Aleinu, we're going to bend our knees and bow as always. But as we bow, we'll continue to go all the way down until our head touches the ground, the earth. Here in South Florida, we forget that the surface on which we stand continues to shift under our feet. Today, traditionally seen as the 5,782nd birthday of this planet. Yes, I know it's a lot older. But still, we put our head against the ever-shifting earth as we pray for healing of this world. As we do so, I invite you to join me either here in the sanctuary at home and use your spiritual eyes to look beneath the floor, into the earth itself. Remember, we're not seeking to look into solid ground. Rather, we're looking into Yehuda Amichai's soil of doubt and love, one dug up like a mole or a plow, one filled with cracks and fissures. It's my hope today that with spiritual eyes, as we say the Aleinu together, as we go about our days in this new year, we discover the holy sparks in the brokenness, and we hear the whisper of God as it reminds us, Adonai Echad, U'Shemo Echad. The peace we crave, it's already here amid the ruins. And it's time to embrace it. Shana Tova.